All right, so what we're going to do now is one last step in understanding value before I give you an example on Wednesday of how to bring everything together. Take the idea of what we talked about with value using shading or hatching or stippling or whatever, and we're going to apply that to drawing an object. So again, I'm going back to this classic mug that I drew before. I'm thinking here, rule of the ellipse for the base. Whatever my center point is, I want to make sure that the top and the bottom are about the same height. Notice how much I was off. I was making the back end too long, but whenever I drew the cross to line up my ellipse, I was able to see where I was off. Now the same thing on the top. Here's another cheat, is to just imagine that line going straight up so you don't get a wonky drawing somewhere. So again, I've got to think about this ellipse. That one should be a little shallower than this one. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and bring that one forward a little bit. So for the rest of this, I just sped it up so that you could see what I was doing, but not take as long as it could be. Haven't figured out how to add music over a sped up part yet. So if any of y'all know how to do that, you can send me a message. I want you on this drawing to either use graphite or a pen. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to come in and draw my dedicated line. My lines were a little bit wobbly, but I did that on purpose because that ceramic mug is not a perfectly shaped, commercial object. It's actually a very organic, handmade object. So I don't mind having a little wobble to my line there. Now here comes the most fun part of the entire class for me. I'm basically, I've always been a painter. I had to teach myself how to really draw after I'd already been doing painting for a long time. So it was kind of a weird reverse. Most people learn to draw first and then paint. I just always started painting. I learned to see overall shapes and forms before I saw lines. And it's a lot easier to establish a large area as a painter. You just find a brush that'll cover the surface easy. When you're using a material like a pen or graphite, you have to cover this entire surface to establish the form. So what we're going to talk about today is how do we take that idea of value, getting that range of light and dark, and applying it to the actual three-dimensionality of an object. But for me, when I learned this, it totally made sense. It completely changed the way I understood three-dimensional space because I could understand the object and I can kind of construct a three-dimensional object using the methods we just did. But when you learn to do this, it's going to make every surface make sense because you're going to basically understand that that rule of the ellipse applies to every single thing that we see existing. Whether it's an object or a surface or a space, everything has a surface description that you can apply to it. Sometimes it'll be very solid and deliberate. Sometimes you might make one that's a little bit soft and fuzzy, but once you understand how to do this, this is where you can really take command of the picture plane. We want to draw in our ground plane. Just make it stop where it goes behind the object. So there's our ground plane. What we're going to do now is we're going to think about where the lights and the darks are on that object. Is we're going to apply the idea of either hatching or cross-hatching and apply the linear direction of the surface, just like on your cross contour drawings. If I wanted to, I'm going to go ahead and make a cross contour on this just to show you that lip. So here's our cross contour. I've got the defined form of the lip. Now this is that secondary form that implies that there's actually a little bit of a descriptive shape to that lip. That's the rule of the ellipse, that there's surface direction that defines the form. So the first thing I'm going to show you is right here, because this is the most obvious shadow that I'm seeing. This is going to be the way we do rendering. If I was going to draw, I'm going to go ahead and draw it just so you can see it. Cross contour lines to describe the surface direction of that form. This is what the cross contour lines would be. Something like that. See how that's describing that form? Up here it would be coming around this, down there. So here's how we're going to apply the value. You don't want to draw those cross contour lines anymore. What you're going to do is you're going to use hatching following those contour lines, cross contour lines. So the cross contour was simply an exercise to understand how three-dimensional space and form is described by those lines. But I'm thinking of the fact, what are the three-dimensionalities of that form? It's wrapping this way, maybe going in a little bit. If I wanted to make this look like it's going in, I could do this. I'm getting a little sloppy because I'm going too quick. So here's what you do. If I wanted to bubble it out, it'd be the opposite. So let's say up here, this one goes in, but over here, let's make it pop out a little bit. Actually, I got to think about the, I'm looking at the real object now, and I'm thinking those lines on the real object to curve toward me actually have to come this way a little bit. So this is going to be what we're going to call rendering. We're basically learning how to use the description of value and surface direction to give an enhanced, basically it becomes an enhanced way of making the three-dimensionality of the object show up. So on this, here's the fun part. When you look at that surface of the actual mug, there's an aspect of it that's going up and there's an aspect that's round. So the beauty of rendering is if you want to go multi-directional, you can describe this surface. Let me just make it, there's a sag in the glaze here that I'm going to draw in very lightly. And then there's some hints of form. So we'll go ahead and put those in. Now then, because these are implied as a flat surface there's actually some waves, but we're not going to get into that. I can think of these as having a direction that goes this way, or the direction that kind of comes across like this. So basically what I'm doing is I'm applying the idea of the rule of the ellipse, a way of understanding perspective. That this surface has a perspective. It kind of exists at this angle. This surface is going to be a little bit closer. This one turns away, then that one turns away more. So as I'm making my value, I'm going to be reinforcing the dimensionality of that surface. So I'll do things like a light shift. Like this will be light, that'll be a little bit darker, that'll be darker. Now, depending on the light and shadow, you can decide how much you want to do that shift. So you, kind of like on your value studies, take your time and make that shift slowly, and then you can always go back and make it more. So in this, I actually have a strong light on this side. So what that means is I'd leave a reflective light over here, probably let this side go from light to dark, which means I'd let this go a little bit from light to dark. Then this will go from light to just a little darker, and this will go from light to just a little darker. And that way you get range of value within each one of these areas. But up here, basically I'm thinking, what is the rounded surface cross contour line? I'm thinking of parallel marks that establish our sense of three-dimensional form. Now, if you want to do it in graphite, it's a lot easier to go back and fix it. So with graphite, a lot of times you can make these sort of marks that are heavy, but you can go back and fix them if you get them too heavy. But notice as I'm drawing, I'm describing the three-dimensional surface. I'm thinking about where those cross contour lines could be drawn, and then I'm actually drawing adding the value following the form. Now on a lip like this, it's up to you. Sometimes if I have different areas going, I may make the lip go a different direction. Now the center, do I want to make it follow the opposite? Because remember, if we're going this way, the cross contour line on the inside of that cylinder is going to go like that. So I can either shade this way, or I can make it stand up. I'm seeing a little both. So what I'd probably do is make a little bit of shading that follows the cross contour line of that lip, making it get darker toward the center. And then you could also bring some lines up, and I'm thinking about the dimensionality here. So make these a little darker toward the edge, make them get a little bit lighter as they come in here. And if you add a line, I find that it's better to go ahead and bring them all the way across. But you can see, just this little bit I've done, how much more sense of three-dimensionality we're getting. That's the beauty of this. Now here's the other thing I don't remember if I said the other day or not. When you draw an object sitting on a surface, the ground plane is always thought of as flat. So I always make strong sense of shading and rendering that follows the dimensionality of that flat surface. So I always have some of it going this way. Remember I said that the light was coming from this side, so what I'm going to do is just bring the shadow being cast on this side. And this is how I usually shade. Lightly shade, and I vary the pressure as I'm coming out here. But notice how that is now described, that that's a three-dimensional surface that we're sitting on, flat, and then you've got the dimensionality of the object. Background is just kind of up to you. A lot of times, if there's a strong background, I'll just make it vertical because that distinguishes it from the ground plane. Now on the ground plane, 1 point perspective, we have to think about, okay, if we're seeing this, where would that vanishing point be? And then we want to make the surface kind of go with that. So if you want to do shading that also follows the perspective on the surface, you can do that as well. But look how much more that is reinforcing three-dimensionality of the object. Now here's one other thing I'm going to just throw in there because we are drawing an object. If you really want to make that object stand up, come in here and make it get dark right next to the object. Because right now this looks like a very flat, looks like I could have taken a, folded sheet of paper and sat it on there. So to give some dimensionality and make it separate from the surface of the ground plane, make it just a little bit darker underneath there, and that gives you that visual floating. It makes this not look so sharp against the edge. It kind of makes it float. And also, when you do your shading, again, this is where chiaroscuro comes in. As you're shading this, leave a little bit of that reflective light right along that surface, and what that does is helps visually separate this object from that shadow. So the main thing I want to see on the drawing that's going to be this assignment, one object, three-dimensionally drawn. I don't want to see every single cross contour. I want to see you make the cross contour into the direction. And if you want to build up multiple layers of different surface direction to give us that idea, I'm fine with that. If you use a tortillon or blending stump, do not over blend it. I still want to see those lines a little bit. Later on, we'll get to where you don't have to do this. You'll just blend it following those forms. But for this assignment, I want to be able to see where you're making your marks so that I understand if you really are getting the correlation between cross contour lines and rendering lines. Pick an object that you don't mind spending some time drawing. Think about your picture plane. Try to make everything purposeful within that. And that'll be it for now.